Religion 230, Week 12 Lecture, The Tridentine Church. The immediate period following the Council of Trent was very lively and energetic, and the period between Trent and Vatican I is known as the Tridentine period. Seminaries were opened. St. Peter's was completed in 1582 as a great symbol of Catholic revival. The College of Cardinals was increased, and its members played increasingly important roles in the Church. They didn't just elect the Pope from among their number, but they also helped to incorporate reform measures throughout the Church. Many bishops also brought the spirit of Trent back to their dioceses and commenced with reform. Probably the most famous is Charles Borromeo, who lived from 1538 to 1584. He was the hugely influential Archbishop of Milan, who stayed at home to oversee reform rather than living in Rome, where the politics and the power were. New organizations were also founded to revive the spirituality and piety of Catholics, such as the Confraternity, which is a social religious organization, founded by Philip Neri for lay people. He then established a new order called the Oratory for secular priests, and secular priests are priests not in a religious order, but those who work for a bishop in a diocese. The Oratorians were approved in 1575 and gave great encouragement and support to diocesan priests in living out their duties. In France, Francis de Sales founded the Salesian order, which focused on caring for and educating young people. And Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac founded the Daughters of Charity, an order for women that was active in the community, and especially focused on helping the poor and women. In Spain, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross were well-known visionaries and mystics, and Teresa in particular is famous as the re-founder and reformer of the Carmelite order, who traveled all over the country to pursue her work. The late 16th and 17th centuries in the Church are often known as Baroque Catholicism. The term is familiar from music and the arts, but it also represented a move toward the large, impressive, and ornate. And the Church in this period is often described as the Church militant, marching to reconquer territory lost to Protestants and find new Christians through mission work. However, the militancy of the age also worked against the Church when the growing divisions between Protestants and Catholics and the inability to accept pluralism, that is, that people of different religions can live side by side in harmony, finally led to war. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 is one of the longest and deadliest wars in European history, and it was certainly the worst religious war. At least 8 million people died. It began in the Holy Roman Empire, but spread to involve all the major powers. There were no real winners in this war, but in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia finally brought an end to the wars of religion in Europe. It began to bring people to realize that religious plurality was simply a reality that people were going to have to accept, although it took the popes much longer to accept that. The provisions of the treaties were largely based on the principle cuius regio, eius religio, and gave secular governments the right of reforming the Church, which of course was totally opposed to what Trent was all about. The treaties guaranteed the freedom of private or public worship to churches that had existed on January 1, 1624. It also determined that ecclesiastical property should be returned to whatever group owned it on that date. Pope Innocent X issued a bull condemning these decisions as invalid, but he was ignored, and everyone was forced to accept it. This represents well the position of the papacy in the 17th and 18th centuries. While in the 16th century the Pope in Rome had been at the center of European thought and culture, Now the position and prestige of the papacy declined dramatically. France was the leading political and cultural force in Europe, and the reality for the Church was that secular leaders held a great deal of indirect and often direct influence and power over the Church. Most states now had, practically speaking, national churches, such as the Gallican Church. That was the arena of activity. Erastianism, or the idea that the state is superior to the Church in ecclesiastical matters, ruled the day. And even a thoroughly pious monarch like the Empress Maria Theresa, the Habsburg ruler of Austria, etc., had no problem about reorganizing the Church in her lands. She reduced the number of monasteries and holidays, she restricted processions and exorcisms, ended the right of the clergy not to be taxed, and restricted the publication of papal decrees. Popes could do little. They were generally quite old and out of touch. All were Italian, and almost all were elected for political reasons. Nepotism was almost universal, and the cardinal nephew was a traditional position. In fact, the one pope of the age who was well regarded, Benedict XIV, was called a pope without nephews. A good example of the weakness of the pope comes from a movement called Jansenism, which began around 1640 as a theological debate on the burning question of the relationship between the free will of human beings and the gift of God's grace, and this had been a central area of disagreement with Protestants during the Reformation. This debate raised secondary issues about the use of the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist, and how the rights of popes and bishops related to these questions. There was no definitive statement from Trent because they could not agree on how to phrase the matter in a sufficiently Augustinian way, that is, how the human will is free, but God's grace is a free gift that constrains the human will to do good. It's hard to make those two fit together. Well, naturally, someone came along who was ready to make a clear statement, and that was Bishop Cornelius Jansen of Ypres. He apparently denied that universal redemption was possible when he said that after the fall, that is, after original sin, human beings need God's all-powerful grace in order to do good or to obey God's commands. But he also argued that this grace was not always given, even to those who asked for it. After original sin, people are free only to commit evil. Jansen's teaching also seemed to imply a strong doctrine of predestination, which was very associated with the teaching of John Calvin, one of the main Protestant reformers, and thus very suspicious. Jansen's book on Augustine, published in 1640, which was 2 years after his death, was put on the Index of Forbidden Books, and a list of 5 of his teachings were condemned by the Pope and the theological faculties at the universities of Paris and Louvain. But while his supporters agreed that those 5 teachings were indeed heretical, they denied that Jansen had actually taught them. So basically they contradicted the Pope and questioned his authority. Jansenism had a number of strong supporters, especially in France, where the convent of Port Royal was the center of Jansenist teaching and practice, which was very rigorous in its morality. The Jesuits took up the fight against the Jansenists, which allowed many people to paint the Jesuits as lax in their morality and in their approach to confession and penance. Blaise Pascal, whose sister was a nun at Port Royal, condemned the Jesuits for their laxity in his work, The Provincial Letters, and also condemned them for being casuists, that is, those who use clever reasoning to get out of moral problems. Pascal is a central figure in the 17th century church, although he started out as a mathematician, inventor, and physicist. But after identifying with Jansenism, he had a religious experience in 1654 and started writing influential works on philosophy and theology. One of these works was his Pensées, a collection of fragmentary statements that was a defense of the Christian faith. Since he died at the young age of 39, the work remained incomplete, but it was very influential and popular. His method was to use the contradictory philosophies of skepticism and Stoicism to bring the reader to despair and confusion, who would then be ready to embrace faith in God. His main conclusions are about humility, human ignorance, and God's grace, and they rest on what is known as Pascal's wager, the idea that human beings bet with their lives that God either exists or does not. And this was the first argument for God's existence based on probability theory. Although Jansenism eventually decreased in importance, it was around for a long time, and some church leaders and many other Catholics who were Jansenists were also supporters of the Enlightenment, the new skepticism and rational approach to science that became characteristic of this age. You've read about Galileo, his trial and condemnation, but also that for many Catholics there was no conflict between faith and reason and science. But during the Enlightenment that began to change, and many of these thinkers were influenced by René Descartes. Descartes was a devout Catholic, but his philosophical system was based on reason, and particularly on doubt. To doubt is to think is to be. The principle of universal doubt threatened the authority of revelation and the Church, while the demand for irrefutable evidence opposed the notion of revealed or religious mysteries. Descartes' exalted view of reason soon became the main, if not the only means of attaining belief for many of those who were influenced by him, while Cartesian skepticism was quickly used to challenge many traditional beliefs. These ideas were a big challenge to the Catholic Church, and Pascal was one of the few successful apologists out there, that is, those scientists or philosophers who actually defended the Church. Most intellectuals were very turned off by theology and the idea of revealed religion.